Hey, and happy Monday, everyone. Happy week 2 of the SEC college football season. What is going on? Lauren Sisler here, hanging out with you, doing a little SEC Insider. And I had all sorts of music and stuff going in my ear, and I was like, what is going on? Hey, week 2 of SEC Insider, hanging out with you. Here to recap the Alabama-Missouri game. Mike Rodak joining us with AL.com. And Alabama picking up the easy win, 38-19 in this one. And that score even a little more lopsided as Missouri punched it in late there in the football game. But, hey, you know what? I just want to first start off saying it was great to watch some SEC college football this weekend. It was great to see Alabama back in the saddle. Obviously, a very weird 2020, but when you get to sit down and watch college football all day on a Saturday, there is nothing like it. And also, I want to shout out our sponsors. There is nothing like All South Appliance Group hanging out. Appreciate the Yeti mug you've given me. They'll be joining us as our sponsor the rest of the season. So let's talk a little football, Mike Rodak. Mac Jones, Jaylen Waddle. Wow, did they not put on a show?
Yeah, I remember the Iron Bowl at the end of last season. I think my story was that it was a preview of coming attractions as far as the 2020 season, because as you might remember, Mac Jones had a pretty good game in the Iron Bowl outside of those 2 interceptions that he threw. Jaylen Waddle had 4 touchdowns in that game, and it just seemed like they picked up right where they left off from last November. It's been almost a year, but that chemistry's there. And, I don't necessarily think that means there isn't chemistry between Mac Jones and Devontae Smith, but I think there really seems to be something with Mac and Jaylen Waddle that could be special this season. And, we saw that play out in this game. It was the second best game of Waddle's career as far as yards, 134 yards in that game, 8 catches was a career high for him. And that, really allowed them to kind of get the game in their control and not allow Missouri to hang around. And, it's something too where I think people were kind of questioning whether Mac Jones would even be the starter, 6, 7, 8 months ago, coming off of last season. And he really, each game that he plays, it seems like he really seems to be more in control of that job. And especially with Bryce Young coming into that game late on Saturday and having the fumble that he lost. He did have a couple of nice plays on third down, but you can kind of see that gap that still exists between Bryce Young and Mac Jones, and that conversation of who should be the starter just doesn't really seem to be valid anymore at this point.
Yeah, obviously not in question. Now, Bryce Young obviously came in 5 of 8, 54 yards, but Mac Jones, 18 of 24, 249 yards on the day. And I go back to this, and I think that this is so critical for a quarterback. This is now Mac Jones's team, right? You get named the starter. You're not kind of dealing with the back and forth, with Tua Tagovailoa, obviously the injury. That's when he was able to come in and finish out the season, the last 4 games for Alabama. But this is his team. He came in this season. He earned the starting job. And I think that just plays into the mindset, the mentality, and saying, okay, I'm going to take ownership of this. And one thing I will say, this football team, despite even last year when Tua Tagovailoa was around, this football team had a great respect for Mac Jones. So it wasn't a huge transition for them, and them just the chemistry and all that, of course, has to be built when you start, when you change up your quarterback and you go from a guy that had such a high profile like Tua Tagovailoa, and then you transition and now Mac Jones becomes the guy. But I think that it's so important to remember that when it is your team, I think it really changes the dynamic and the chemistry with all the players. And it certainly showed up in this first game, and Jaylen Waddle, nothing short of impressive in this one. Always fun to watch. I know Michael Casagrande used to call him the water bug. And I would have to say that we saw a lot of that, just the way he jukes and jives and moves. And, he's just really twitchy and just a fun player to watch. And so I think it's interesting. One question before we get to the defense, I'd be curious to know, Mike, I know Bryce Young, we thought we would perhaps see him. Do you think that because of the, red shirt rule, or the fact that, this year technically doesn't count for players, is that going to play in favor of Alabama and we're going to see more of Bryce Young because of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. It's going to depend on how the games go. If they're tight in the third and fourth quarter, I don't think they're going to be putting Bryce Young into the game because, as we heard, from Nick Saban on Saturday night, they sacrificed something offensively to put Bryce in the game and to take Mac out. So,
Mm-hmm.
They're winning by 20, 30. Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be similar to, Talia coming into the game, Mac coming into the game, when Tua is quarterback. And like you said, too, I mean, the redshirt rule is kind of moot this year. There's no eligibility clock, essentially, that's moving this year. Plus, the eligibility rule that changed a couple of years ago where you can play 4 games and still redshirt, I think comes into play as well. So at the end of the day, I think they're going to play him as much as they can just to get him ready for whenever he's a starter. But I just don't think him being the starter is right on the doorstep right now.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Okay, so defensively, I'm going to get Patrick to pop up this play. I loved how you kind of said it. The play of the week here, the return, I guess the return of the defense is such a big part of this Alabama sort of standard. And you see there LeBron Ray, Dylan Moses getting in there, absolutely rocking Missouri quarterback Sean Robinson. Take a look at the replay here. I mean, look, I think the fact that Dylan Moses, was obviously absent last year with injury, plays into it. That defense was absolutely marred last year. I mean, just more injuries than we've ever seen from an Alabama defense in a very, very long time. But to kind of see that sort of play, that physicality, especially this early in the season, was pretty impressive.
Yeah, and on that play, I think the thing that stood out to me live just watching it was that the three out of the 4 players that were around the quarterback weren't really on the team last year, didn't really play, shall I say. Between Dylan Moses, who was hurt all year, LeBron Ray most of the year, and then Will Anderson, freshman, who just came in and has made a pretty big impact himself. So you're talking about a new group of players, and you can kind of see how the level of play has been raised. And then that's true for, I think, a lot of the game, too. I know fans were kind of down on the defense coming out of it, and I'm sure the late touchdown makes things look a little bit differently in the box score. But I thought the defense played pretty well, at least through the first 2.5, maybe 3 quarters. And they had a couple of long drives they gave up here and there. I think they would have gotten off the field if it wasn't for the penalty on Malachi Moore on that third down back by Dylan Moses. And that was, speaking of Moses, one of a couple plays that he made. He had that 4th down stop early in the game too, and it just seemed like they were able to play more aggressively, with him in the game. It seems like they were blitzing up the middle a lot with those linebackers. They were doing some more exotic things than what at times seemed to be a little bit more vanilla on defense last year, just because they had Christian Harris and Shane Lee starting as freshmen, and it's harder to move things around and to do complex things defensively with them in the game. And it seems like, the defense that they played on Saturday night was a little bit higher level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one thing worth keeping in mind, defensively, from a defensive standpoint, when, the lack of off-season training, the lack of being together for an entire season, I think that sometimes goes under the radar. Yes, these guys were able to, during COVID, to go work out. It was sort of up to them to work out and put in the reps and whatnot. But there is still nothing like putting the pads on and repping out every day in practice. And so you got to imagine some of that too, as you said, kind of the first, 2.5 quarters of the game. But you start to see guys get a little bit gassed, just a little bit tired. And I think that's sort of natural. And I think we've seen that from a lot of football teams, just in terms of the defense really being able to sort of play to that level for all 4 quarters. And I think that as the season rolls on, that we'll see a substantial improvement in that even as well. But it is exciting to see, the defense kind of get out there and make some big plays, some statement plays that really, kind of stand for what Alabama defense has always been all about. And, I think having Dylan Moses is such a big, powerful, statement guy that really brings that defense together and helps with the chemistry, but also just the guy that's going to be back there communicating. And he was such a huge loss for Alabama last year. And I think he's definitely going to be one that's going to, hopefully have a great season ahead and to really help lead that defense, most certainly. And I guess lastly, kind of looking at what the Tide can improve on. Alabama is going to play Texas A&M 2:30 in Tuscaloosa. Next up, that's October 3rd. So just if there's one area that you really would like to see the Tide improve on, what would it be, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Nick Saban talked after the game about how they need more depth, and I think that did show itself, offensively in some ways in this game, this past game on Saturday, where, they got great play out of Mac Jones and Jaylen Waddle, and I think to a certain extent Devontae Smith and Najee Harris, but those are the guys who they know are the core they want to build something behind that as well. And I think especially a running back, it showed up a little bit where maybe they were a little bit shakier. And that, Trey Sanders, I think, is probably the biggest name that people might kind of knock on after this game. And he had 9 carries for just 1 yard. And I think he touched the ball 10 total times for negative yardage. And he was one of their best recruits last year, missed all the season with a foot injury. And I think the expectations for him, long-term are pretty high. Not a great start for him in this game. And you go back to what Steve Sarkisian, the offensive coordinator, said during the preseason, was that they wanted to not just have Najee Harris be the guy who just carried the ball all the time. And that didn't really happen on Saturday. Najee Harris had the first 13 carries of the game.
Right.
They didn't really rotate anybody else in. And then when finally Brian Robinson was in the game and then Trey Sanders was in the game, the results just weren't there. Not only with Trey Sanders, but Brian Robinson also dropped that potential touchdown pass too. So I think that's the biggest thing, is just getting some more proven weapons, if you want to call it that, offensively behind what we all know are the main guys.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think the depth and the backup aspect of that, being able to feel confident in your backups to go in the game and obviously perform at a high level. Penalties also another thing I think that certainly can be cleaned up. The offensive line, I think, did a good job in sort of protecting the quarterback, but they did have some of those pre-snap penalties that I think will be a big point of emphasis for, Alabama and for the offensive line more specifically moving forward, and just cleaning those things up, because we know that Nick Saban's always going to find things that he wants to be fixed, no matter if it's a perfect game, a shutout. It doesn't matter. Always things to improve on. And, I think a good foundation to start the 2020 college football season for Alabama. Again, next up, Texas A&M at 2:30 in Tuscaloosa. Mike Rodak, we appreciate the insight as always. And we also want to say thank you to our sponsors, All South Alliance, proud sponsor of SEC Insider, inviting you to visit myallsouth.com or any one of the showrooms across Alabama, Tennessee, and Florida.